If you know your neighbor, it makes it a whole lot more difficult for you to hate them.
Strengthen community by building bridges and bringing unity. On this episode of Let's Talk Cincy, from the marches and services to the organization stepping up to serve, the local effort to make the dream of civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. a reality.
Plus, she pushed for change in the 1960s after a bus was bombed in Alabama.
The civil rights movement was nonviolent, and you had to be nonviolent. And I was determined I was going to do it because I wanted my mother to be able to vote.
The story of local freedom rider Betty Daniels Roseman and how she continues to lend her voice in the fight for equality.
From WLWT, this is Let's Talk Cincy.
Welcome to Let's Talk Cincy. I'm Alexis Rogers.
And I'm Curtis Fuller. It was 1983 when President Ronald Reagan signed into law the federal holiday to honor Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The first holiday actually was celebrated in 1986.
The holiday is the third Monday in January, but King's actual birthday is January 15th. He was a Baptist reverend who led the U.S. civil rights movement starting in the mid-1950s, and he delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech in the March on Washington in 1963 and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Tragically, he was assassinated in Memphis in 1968. In 1961, men and women from all walks of life challenged segregated bus terminals in the South.
The Freedom Rides movement was organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, better known as CORE. I talked with one freedom rider, 80-year-old Betty Daniels Roseman, about why she joined the group and challenged segregation with nonviolence.
It was when the first Freedom Ride, the group left Washington. They were headed for New Orleans. They were coming to New Orleans to help set up. And you remember that the bus was bombed in Alabama, Anniston, Alabama. So that was my deciding factor. Emotionally, I go back to all of it from the beginning when I first joined CORE, the training, how dedicated we were one to another. And I want to say this, that it was a motivation. We could not stop. I tell people when I speak, it was a motivation from God. We couldn't stop. Once we started, there was no way we could turn around. And I speak for myself, but if you could talk to some of the other CORE members, they would tell you the same thing. Every time we boarded a bus to leave home to go on a freedom ride, we didn't know if we would ever return home. And it was very hard because I would have to tell my family, I will see you later, I'll see you in the morning, and we're going to Alabama, we'll be back tomorrow. But it was very hard because we knew the chances were that we may not be returning. Freedom Riders were testers. All of the legislation that was passed to end segregation throughout the Deep South, but it was not being adhered to. There were laws, there were bills that were passed, but there was still segregation going on. So we went on a freedom ride. It was 4 young ladies and 1 young man. He was a white student. He joined our CORE group. His name was Frank Nelson Jr., and he came from California down to New Orleans to help with our group. We went to Birmingham, testing along the way. On the way back from Birmingham, we didn't get served at any of the white, restaurants or anything in the bus station. We came to a little town in Mississippi. It was called Poplarville, Mississippi. Now this little town already had a reputation. This little town had had a lynching there maybe a year before the Freedom Rides. And the young man was a black man that lived there. His name was Charles Mack Parker Jr. And he was accused of looking or whistling at a white woman in a store, and he was brutally beaten. He was murdered, and he was thrown in the Pearl River in Poplarville. On the way back from Birmingham, it was around 8 o'clock that night when the bus pulled into Poplarville. The riders on the bus had assignments. My assignment on that ride was to make a phone call if anything happened along the way. I was to call New Orleans Corps and let them know what was going on. The two girls and Frank got off. They were to get off and go into the bus station and test to see if they would be served. We were on the bus, the other two girls and I, and the three of them went into the station. A few minutes later, truckloads of men, white men, pull up. They ran into the bus station, and they literally drugged Frank and the two young girls. They were black students, drugged them out of the bus station, threw them in the back of the pickup truck, and drove off.
Mrs. Roseman saw a nearby phone booth, got off the bus, called for help, but the bus driver pulled off.
So I was praying and asking God to help me, because I knew if they found me, I would be another victim in the Pearl River.
A Good Samaritan helped and drove her to safety. Her friends were eventually found safe as well after a call from Attorney General Bobby Kennedy.
We were told that he told them if anything happened to those three young people, he would have the troops in Poplarville in the morning. So they didn't kill them.
She, like so many other citizens, admired Dr. King. She shared with me the one time she met him when she was just a teenager. He was speaking in New Orleans.
When Dr. King came out, we were yelling his name so loud. And he saw us, and he came over. But I want to tell you, Curtis, he fussed at us. He scolded us. He shook his finger at us. He said, "How come you're not in school?" And we said, "We wanted to see you, Dr. King. We wanted to see you." And he said, "Well, that's good." He said, "But I want you to stay in school. That is more important." He patted us on the head and he thanked us, but he told us stay in school. So he really, education was important to him, and he wanted to make a difference for everybody. And there was nobody greater, in my opinion, in the civil rights movement than Dr. King. So I know we're gonna see him again, and I know his dream is fulfilled. I know that it's okay.
She's a remarkable woman, and always good to chat with her. You know, the 1961 Freedom Rides were modeled after a similar movement in 1947 called the Journey of Reconciliation. Mrs. Roseman said she ultimately wanted to dismantle segregated systems that prevented her mother from voting.
The first infamous ride from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans involved 13 people. Ultimately, nearly 500 people will become Freedom Riders, most notably Congressman John Lewis, who was only 21 years old at the time.
Hard to think of him at 21.
I know, still a fighter.
Yeah. Well, continuing Dr. King's legacy, next on Let's Talk Cincy, the events that let the sound of freedom ring throughout Greater Cincinnati.
And how the next generation is doing its part to share Dr. King's words.
Welcome back. The words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. helped spark change in America.
His message still bridging the divide in the U.S. and right here in Cincinnati.
It means freedom for me. It means freedom for us all.
The commemorative Civil Rights March in downtown Cincinnati means something different for everyone, but the message is the same.
You're not just walking for yourself, you're walking for all those that also can't walk or who have given their life and given their time, to fight for social injustice. And it's just a wonderful feeling that we both have, realizing that we're not just doing it for ourselves, but we're doing it for our futures also.
Cody Agee marches with his daughter every year. He's one of hundreds who spend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day honoring the legacy of the civil rights giant. Clifton Curry marches with his fraternity.
as time passes, it seems that people are starting to forget, and so we come out every year to continue to support. Because if we don't do it, nobody's going to do it.
From the Freedom Center, the group stopped at Fountain Square for an interfaith prayer service, then on to Music Hall. The sound of freedom rang loud and clear.
We all know that so much of what Dr. King worked for was civic engagement and involvement. Dr. King said our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter.
The same sentiment was echoed at a celebration in Erlanger.
He took the steps, and it doesn't take extraordinary individuals to make extraordinary change. It's about engagement, it's about intentionality, it's about being who you are.
Kentucky State Senator Gerald Neal recited King's words, ones he says more people should live by.
His message is still audible to all who will listen. The very fact that 57 years after his death, we still celebrate his life and is a prime indicator of what a lasting effect this great man has had.
A special moment, a video highlighting the diversity of Kenton County and a young man who memorized King's I Have a Dream speech.
I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain will be made low, and the rough places will be made plain, the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. 9-year-old Dante Hall says King was an important person, and this is a powerful speech for all to hear. Here's his favorite excerpt.
Free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. It tells us how we broke free and now how we are today.
Neal says Dante represents hope in the future, that King's legacy will live on.
It's about the next generation. You see, that baton has to be handed over at some point. What will they do? What will we leave them? What will we teach them?
Gone but not forgotten. Community leaders reflect on the legacy of Dr. King.
The lessons we can learn from the past, plus the church's effort to bring a unified community together. When Let's Talk Cincy returns. Welcome back. I talked to some local leaders about where we've been, where we are, and where do we go from here, including one person with strong family ties to the civil rights leader.
It was significant. My father actually knew Dr. King's mother first. They worked in one of the major Baptist conventions together. And then, of course, my dad got to know Dr. King on a personal level when his wife founded the King Center in Atlanta. He was one of the founding members. And then when the convention split, those who, my dad who formed the Progressive National Baptist Convention left the National Baptist Convention. Prior to that, they had kicked Dr. King out. They kicked his father out. And so when my father formed here in Cincinnati in 1961, the Progressive National Baptist Convention, that helped to give Dr. King, one, a denominational home, and it helped him to get his message out on a national basis. So the ties were very significant, and they were very deep, and they were meaningful. I had the privilege of meeting Dr. King when I was 10, and even at that age, it began to change my life. When I decided the college I was going to, I did that largely because of Dr. King, the fraternity I pledged, and all that. We named our son Martin, but something about Dr. King struck me and his work and what he tried to do, and it has stayed within my heart. So I've tried to live that in my personal life and in all the work that I do to try to be an agent of change, which is Dr. King was. He was one of the greatest agents of change that we know, and he was willing to put it all on the line.
I dare say that Dr. King would have been despairing to see the direction in which society has evolved presently. And, you know, his voice and his message, it seems to me, are even more important today. That's hard to imagine. It's a slogan to say something like that, but when you think about it, you know, it seems that we as an American society, we were listening more carefully to that message in earlier times, and that the times in which we live right now, presently, we need that message more than ever.
I think King would give us the mark of needs improvement. A lot of people, when King died, they thought that he's gone, but he left a legacy. There is still work to do. He did his part in the civil rights movement and for the struggle for peace and for freedom and for equity and justice. And all of us have a role to play as well. We can't just say, well, King did this during the 1960s and that's it. There's still work for us to do from 1960s on till today, and there will still be work that's left to do for my kids and their kids as well.
I really hope that more and more people will garner inspiration to work together and to make his dream a reality. I sure would like to leave my kids that kind of a world. I know you would too.
We are continuing the conversation now about Dr. King and, of course, the freedom and that he stood for so long.
And of course, we're joined by Reverend Paul Booth Jr. and Pastor Steve Bester. You all, thank you so much for joining us. You both have a deep history when it comes to Dr. King. We can start with you, Reverend Booth. I mean, when it comes to Dr. King and your family, they literally used to come to your family's home.
Absolutely. One of Dr. King's last visits to Cincinnati was sponsored by, from an invitation from my grandfather. He came to speak at Zion Baptist Church. My dad has fond memories of him actually staying with my grandfather, staying at the house. Actually, we still have a comic book, a Bible comic book where Dr. King had signed that we've kind of passed down as a family heirloom. So those moments are just priceless, and now to be able to recount them as the next generation is not only a powerful legacy, but also continue to give me motivation for the work to do ahead.
And there aren't many pictures that we see with Dr. King that we don't see your granddad, Reverend Shuttlesworth. I mean, the big three, him and Reverend Abernathy. And I know that your mom and talks about him all the time. What your memories of your granddad and also the connection with Dr. King?
Yeah, actually, it's through pictures and all the memorabilia all throughout the year. My oldest cousin, Tony, is the godson. He's an Alpha Phi Alpha brother of his, so shout out. But yes, that's the great connection that the King family, they were down to earth, great people, but they remembered where they came from. And the SCLC, the Christian leadership, they wanted God to be the forefront of what they were doing. No violence. What would Jesus do is what so my memories of him pretty much, again, all pictures. I was born in '68, so he kind of checked out the April of that year, so I didn't really get to know him personally or that, but our families are intertwined forever. And of course, with the Booth family, it's just an incredible trifecta of men.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the legacy of his service here in Cincinnati and what we see now today, because we continually see the spirit of service with Dr. King's legacy.
Yes, absolutely. I think right now in Cincinnati, I think we're experiencing a shift. Pastor Bester and I just talked about that, to see the next generation taking over and carrying on that work, not only continuing to keep the kingdom work alive going, but how do we infiltrate the community now, right? Dr. King, I think one of the key parts of his legacy was about economic justice. And I think that we're returning to a day and time where the church will be the impetus for the economic justice in the community, especially when we look at the transformation of the urban core. How does the church become a part of that to make sure that the people are left behind?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you now just took over as pastor of Greater New Light, and I would imagine the emphasis will be to bring in a lot of young people too.
Big time. That's right there in the North Avondale area. Gentrification has set in, and we realized that the church, they were packed back in our days. Our grandfathers didn't have empty seats in the pews. Everybody came because that was the mecca of the movement down south, and they brought it up here, and people gathered around the church to understand we have to empower each other. I just talked with Pastor Lynch III the other day, and he was saying the exact same thing. We have to teach wealth. Sunday school, we know all the Bible, we've got all the Bible, but we now have to get wealth and income into our communities.
Wow. I mean, that's very, very important. Thank you all so much for joining us. Next on Let's Talk Cincy, embodying the values of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s love, selflessness, and kindness.
The volunteers who rolled up their sleeves for a day of service. The King holiday is intended as a day of service.
Organizations around Greater Cincinnati gave their time and their talents to strengthen the community by giving people what they need.
The culture of serving others is the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Days before the holiday, more than 100 volunteers from Give Back Cincinnati honored Dr. King with its annual day of service. Armed with paintbrushes, it was a labor of love at Roberts Academy in Price Hill. They painted murals and bathrooms to make the school a little more welcoming for more than 800 kids from pre-K through 8th grade.
This is the first event we hosted 20 years ago, so we're really excited to be bringing our 20th anniversary as part of Martin Luther King Day and just be making a difference this.
At the Freedom Center, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity and Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority's services of the day were focused on health.
Everybody can't help themselves, and the more that you can help someone else, it could change the life of the person after them.
This 12-year blood drive effort has saved hundreds of lives in heavily impacted communities.
Giving blood is always important, but especially within the African American community. Locally, only about 4% of the blood donors are African American.
As donors continue to give blood, Alpha Kappa Alpha teamed up with Jewish and Mercy hospitals to provide easily accessible mammograms.
Mammography is very important. Many women, everyone can look at the statistics, breast cancer on the rise, and this is the first step in stopping that.
The goal is to make each person better.
Service is important for everyone because we have to give back. We are not on this globe by ourselves. We have to come together and we have to address the issues that affect every single person in our communities, black, white, brown, red. We have to just come together.
A notion that both groups hope to be seen throughout the year.
It's important that we realize we're all human. We all have the same fears, aspirations, goals, and there's much more commonality than things that divide us.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's good to focus on what people are doing on King Day. You know, it's good to look back, but there's so much work that needs to be done even now.
And people take it to heart, young, older, or more seasoned, as I like to call everyone. Yeah. It's amazing to see how big his legacy has been, especially in a city like Cincinnati. I think that we celebrate that day, really the week, really in a different way than many other cities.
Oh yeah, when you look around what other people are doing outside of places like Atlanta, I mean, Cincinnati does a great job. You know, this was the 45th year for the march, so it's been good. Well, that does it for this edition of Let's Talk Cincy.
Of course, we want to hear from you. Please email us all of your thoughts and ideas at ltc@WLWT.com. You can also see all the full episodes on our website at WLWT.com. Stay encouraged.